They said the Hollis place was haunted. They said no one ever saw Ezra Hollis come to town anymore. Not for flour, not for nails, not even for church. And a man who stops coming to church in a country that small has either found God too completely or lost him altogether. They said you could ride past that ranch at dusk and see four small shapes moving in the yard like ghosts, and never once a grown man among them. What they did not say, because not one soul in Coldwater, Wyoming knew it, was that Ezra Hollis had been dead since the first frost, and that four little girls had buried him themselves behind the barn with their own blistered hands and had told no one, and were running 30 head of cattle and a failing winter ranch entirely alone so that the bank in town would not learn there was no man left to hold the note.
And into all of that, on a gray afternoon in the autumn of 1888, a war widow named Clara Finch came walking up the wagon road with a carpet bag in her hand and a letter in her pocket, expecting to marry a man she had never met. But before we get to the woman, and before we get to the terrible thing she found waiting under that roof, we have to understand how a person comes to answer an advertisement for a husband in the first place. To understand that, we go back a little further and we go east to the state of Missouri, where the war had taken everything from Clara Finch except her stubbornness. She was 31 years old that autumn. She had married young, the way girls did then, to a quiet farmer named Tom Finch, who went off to fight when the country tore itself apart and came home 3 years later with a cough that never left him and a hollow place behind his eyes. He lived 8 more years.
They were good years, mostly, though no children came, and when the people of her town wished to be unkind, they found a way to make even that her fault. Then Tom's lungs gave out one March, and Clara buried him and discovered that the farm had been mortgaged twice over to pay for medicine, and that a widow with no sons and no money and no youth left to trade on was, in the eyes of the world, very nearly nothing at all. She took in washing. She took in sewing. She sat up nights with sick neighbors who paid her in eggs and then talked about her behind their hands by daylight. She was not bitter, exactly. Clara Finch had decided long ago that bitterness was a luxury, like sugar, that a poor woman could not afford to keep in the house.
But she was tired in a way that sleep did not touch, and she was lonely in a way that had begun to frighten her. And so when she saw the advertisement in the back pages of a periodical that traveled west to east through the mail, she read it 3 times before she let herself believe it. Wanted, it said. A wife of good character and strong constitution, willing to keep a home and help with the raising of children on a cattle ranch in Wyoming territory. Widower preferred. No beauty required, only kindness and a willing hand. Honest dealing promised in return. She wrote that very night by the light of a single tallow candle because tallow was cheaper than wax. She told the truth in her letter, which was more than most did.
She wrote that she was no longer young and had no fortune, that she could not give him sons because the Lord had not seen fit, but that she could cook and sew and nurse the sick and grow a garden out of poor ground, and that she had buried a good man and knew what it was to grieve, and that she would be a faithful and honest wife to anyone willing to have her as she was. The answer came back 6 weeks later in a child's careful hand, which she thought strange but explained to herself as the work of a daughter writing for a father whose own hand had stiffened with age or labor. "Come," the letter said, "we will be glad of you. Take the railroad to Rock Springs, and from there the freight road north to Coldwater, and ask anyone for the Hollis Ranch. We are sorry there is no money to send for your passage, but we will make it right when you come." So Clara Finch sold what little she had, which was almost nothing, and bought a ticket west, and rode the rails for 4 days through country that grew steadily emptier and harder and more beautiful and more frightening, until she stepped down at last into a wind that smelled of sage and snow and felt as though it had been blowing across that high, cold land since the beginning of the world and had no intention of ever stopping. The freighter who carried her north from Rock Springs was an old man named Burl with a face like cracked saddle leather, and he did not speak much for the first 10 miles. Then, when she told him where she was bound, he looked at her sideways for a long moment and chewed on whatever he had in his cheek and said only, "You kin to the Hollises?" "I'm to marry Mr. Hollis," she said. The old man's eyebrows climbed, and then something passed over his face that she would think about later, much later, when she understood it. "Well," he said, "folks don't see much of Ezra these days," and he would say no more, and the wind filled the silence the rest of the way. He let her down at the foot of the wagon road as the afternoon was going gray because his team was tired and the ranch lay a good mile back from the freight road, and he would not take his wagon up that rutted track for love nor money with the light failing. He set her carpetbag in the dust beside her and touched his hat and said, "Good luck to you, missus," in a voice that had more pity in it than a good wish ought to carry. And then he was gone, and Clara Finch was alone on a road in a country 50 miles from anywhere she knew, walking toward a house and a man she had never seen. She saw the smoke first, a thin gray thread of it rising from a stovepipe, and she was glad of it, because smoke meant a fire, and a fire meant warmth, and warmth meant welcome.
Then she saw the house, low and long and built of logs gone silver with weather, with a sod roof and a sagging porch, and a barn behind it, and a corral, and beyond all of it the land rolling away brown and gold to a horizon already darkening with the early dusk of the high country in autumn. And she saw the children. There were 4 of them in the yard, and they froze when they saw her the way wild things freeze, every one of them turning at once. The tallest could not have been more than 13. She had a man's wool coat on over a faded dress, the sleeves rolled up thick at the wrists, and an axe in her hands, and she had been splitting wood. The next was perhaps 10, with a bucket. A third, maybe 7, stood in the doorway of the barn with a hen tucked under one arm. And the smallest, who could not have been 5, sat on the porch step with her thumb in her mouth and her eyes enormous. Clara stopped at the edge of the yard. "Hello," she called gently. "I'm looking for the Hollis Ranch." The oldest girl did not lower the axe. "This is it," she said. Her voice was older than her years and harder than it should have been. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Finch. I've come a long way." She drew the letter from her pocket and held it up like a flag of truce. "I've come to marry your father, Mr. Ezra Hollis. He wrote to me, or someone did." And there it was. She saw it cross all 4 faces at once, the way wind crosses grass, a kind of flinching, a kind of fear, and the oldest girl's knuckles went white on the axe handle, and the little one on the step began very quietly to cry. "Pa's not here," the oldest girl said. "When will he be back? I can wait. I've waited 4 days on a train. I can certainly wait an—" "He's not here," the girl said again, louder, and the second girl, the one with the bucket, set it down and came to stand beside her sister, and the 2 of them stood shoulder to shoulder in the failing light, like a wall, like 2 soldiers, and Clara Finch felt the first cold finger of dread touch the back of her neck. She had nursed too many dying men not to know the smell of a house where something was terribly wrong. She had buried a husband and learned the particular silence that lives in a home after death has come and gone. And she looked at these 4 children standing alone in a yard at dusk in the middle of 50 miles of nothing, with no man's voice calling from the barn, no man's boots on the porch, no man anywhere. Only the smoke, only the wood the child had been splitting because someone had to, only the fear in their faces, sharp as a struck match. And she understood, all at once and completely, something that made her set her carpetbag down very slowly in the dust. "Children," she said, and she kept her voice as soft and level as she knew how, the voice she used on men in fever. "Where is your father?" For a long moment, no one answered. The wind moved through the sage. Somewhere, a loose board on the barn knocked, knocked, knocked. Then the smallest one, the one on the step, took her thumb out of her mouth, and in the clear, merciless honesty of the very young, she said, "Pa's behind the barn. We put him in the ground when the leaves came down. Mary said we mustn't tell." And the oldest girl, Mary, made a sound like something breaking and dropped the axe in the dirt and put her face in her hands. Clara Finch did not scream. She did not faint or weep or back away toward the road. She had seen too much of death to be frightened of it, and she had a heart that, whatever the world had decided about her worth, was built for exactly this moment, though she had not known it until now. She crossed the yard. She knelt down in the cold dust in front of the oldest girl, this child of 13 who had been carrying something no grown woman should have to carry, and she did not touch her, because you do not grab a wounded animal, but she said, very quietly, "How long?"
Mary lowered her hands. Her face was wet and white, and her chin was trembling, but her eyes, when they met Clara's, were the eyes of a soldier who has been holding a line alone too long and has just seen, on the horizon, the first impossible glimpse of help.
"Since the leaves turned," she whispered, "he took sick in his chest. It went fast. There wasn't anybody to send for. We're 40 miles from a doctor, and Pa always said," her voice cracked, "he always said you don't trust the bank to know your business. So we couldn't tell. If we told, they'd come and take the land. There's a note on it. A man comes from the bank in the spring to collect, and if there's no money and no man." She stopped. She straightened her thin shoulders. "So we didn't tell. We've been getting on. We have. We sold some cattle. We've been getting on." And Clara looked from her to the others. The second girl, Ruth, 10 years old with a jaw set like iron. The third, little Esther, 7, still clutching her hen. The baby, whose name she would learn was Naomi, 4 years old and crying without sound. And she did the only arithmetic that mattered, the arithmetic of the heart, and the sum of it was this. She had come across half a country to marry a stranger and keep his house, and the stranger was dead in the cold ground behind the barn, and there was no marriage to be had and no man to provide and no reason on this earth for her to stay, and 4 motherless, fatherless children were standing in front of her in the dark, alone. "Mary," she said, "when did you children last eat a hot supper?" The girl blinked, as though of all the questions in the world, this was the one she had not expected. "We've got beans," she said, "and cornmeal. We've been careful with it." "That isn't what I asked." Clara stood, and she picked up the axe from where it had fallen, and she handed it back to the child, handle first, the way you return a thing to its rightful owner. Then she took off her good coat, the only good coat she had, and she rolled up her own sleeves. "I asked when you last ate a hot supper, and the answer, I think, is too long ago. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to show me your kitchen and your stores and where the well is, and I am going to make you children a supper that sticks to your ribs, and we will talk about the rest of it in the morning when there's food in you and light in the sky, because nothing was ever decided wisely in the dark on an empty stomach. Can you show me the kitchen?"
And Mary Hollis, who had not cried in front of her sisters in 2 months because she believed that if she ever once started, she would not be able to stop and they would all be lost, began to cry again, but differently this time, and she nodded, and she led the stranger inside. The inside of the house told Clara everything the children's pride had tried to hide. It was clean, painfully, desperately clean, the floor swept and the few dishes washed, because the oldest girl had clearly been holding the place together by sheer force of will and a child's faith that if she just kept everything tidy, the world would not notice anything was wrong. But the wood box held only kindling. The cornmeal sack, when Clara lifted it, weighed almost nothing. There was a string of dried beans, a little salt, a twist of coffee hoarded like gold, and in the cold of the lean-to, a single laying hen's worth of eggs and a quarter side of bacon gone nearly to rind. It was the larder of children who had been rationing themselves toward starvation by inches, too frightened and too proud to ask anyone for help, watching the bottom of every sack come closer and saying nothing. Clara Finch looked at all of it, and she felt something move in her chest that was half grief and half a fury so clean and bright it nearly took her breath. Fury at a world that could leave 4 little girls to this. Fury at every comfortable soul in Coldwater who had clucked about the haunted Hollis place and never once ridden out to sea. And she put both of those feelings away in the place where she kept such things, and she got to work. She built the fire up. She set water to boil. She took the rind of bacon and rendered the last of its fat and saved every drop. She found, in the garden gone to frost behind the house, 3 woody carrots and a handful of potatoes the children had not dug because they had not known the frost would take them, and an onion or 2 run half to seed. She begged from the children the truth of what they had, and they gave it up slowly, like soldiers surrendering a fort, each admission costing them something.
and out of bacon fat and beans soaked fast in hot water, and potatoes and carrots and onion, and a fistful of cornmeal worked into dumplings, and salt, and the long, slow patience of a woman who had cooked good food out of nothing her whole life, she made a stew. It took her until full dark and well past it. The children would not go to bed. They sat at the table and watched her work the way the starving watch, not begging, only watching, and the smell that filled that house was a smell those children had not smelled since their father died, the smell of someone taking care of them. When it was ready, she filled 4 bowls to the brim before she filled her own, and she set them down, and little Naomi looked at hers and then up at Clara with those enormous eyes and said, "Is it for keeps, or do we have to make it last?" And that, not the grave behind the barn, not the empty larder, not the axe in the 13-year-old's hands, that was the thing that nearly undid Clara Finch. That a 4-year-old had already learned to ask whether kindness was the kind you could keep or the kind you had to ration. "It's for keeps," Clara said when she could trust her voice. "Eat all you want. There's more." They ate like wolves. They ate like children who had been hungry a long time and had pretended otherwise. And Clara Finch ate her own bowl slowly and watched them, and somewhere in the middle of it she made a decision, though she did not say it aloud yet, the decision that would shape the rest of all their lives, which was simply that she was not going anywhere. She slept that first night on a pallet by the stove, and she heard the children breathing in the next room, 4 sets of breath, finally slow and easy. Finally, the breath of sleep without fear. And she lay awake a long time, listening to the wind, and once, far off, the cry of a coyote. And she stared at the dark roof beams, and she said a plain prayer to a God she was not always certain was listening. She did not ask him for anything. She only said, "I see what you've put in front of me. I'll not pretend I don't." And then she slept. In the morning, over coffee made strong because some mornings a body needs coffee worth drinking, she got the whole of it from Mary, and the whole of it was worse than she had feared. The note on the land was held by the bank in Coldwater, and the man who ran that bank was named Silas Crane, and Mary spoke his name the way you speak the name of a thing that has teeth. Ezra Hollis had borrowed against the ranch 2 years back to buy more cattle in a hard season, and the loan came due in the spring, and there was a payment owing of $240, which to those children was the same as $240,000. They had no money. They had 30 head of cattle, fewer now than the spring before, because they had sold some quietly to a passing buyer for far less than they were worth, not daring to drive them to market themselves, and not daring to let anyone know why their father did not bring them. And there was something else, Mary said, something her father had said in his last clear days, gripping her hand. Crane had wanted the Hollis land for years. It sat across the only good year-round creek for miles, and Crane had been buying up the country around it parcel by parcel, and he had as much as told Ezra to his face that one way or another, that creek would be his. Ezra had told him to go to the devil. And then Ezra had died. And now there was no one to tell Silas Crane anything at all. "He'll take it," Mary said, and her hands were wrapped around her coffee cup so tight her knuckles were white. "When the snow melts and we can't pay, he'll take it, and he'll have a paper that says it's legal, and there's not a soul who'll stand up for 4 girls and a—" She could not say it. "And nobody." Clara Finch sat with that for a while. Then she said, "Does anyone in town know your pa is gone?" "No," fierce. "And they can't. The minute they know, Crane'll know, and he'll have the law out here before the ground's even thawed. As long as they think pa's just gone strange and won't come to town, we've got till spring. We've got time." "Time for what?" And Mary Hollis looked at her, this child who had been the man of a ranch since she was 13, and she said the saddest, brave thing Clara had ever heard. "I don't know," she said. "I just knew if I gave up, we'd lose everything Pa ever worked for. So I didn't give up. I figured I'd think of something." Clara reached across the table then and laid her hand over the girl's white-knuckled fist, and Mary did not pull away. "You've thought of something," Clara said. "You thought of writing that advertisement, didn't you? It wasn't your pa who answered me. It was you." The girl's eyes filled. "I found it in his papers," she whispered. "An old one he'd written, after Ma died, before he changed his mind about it. I thought, I thought if a woman came, a grown woman, then there'd be somebody. Somebody the bank would have to take serious. Somebody to—" Her voice broke entirely. "I'm sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry I brought you all this way for nothing. I didn't know what else to do. I'm only 13, and I didn't know what else to do." And Clara Finch gathered that child into her arms at last, and Mary Hollis broke against her and wept the way she had not let herself weep in 2 months, great racking sobs that shook her whole thin body. And Clara held her and rocked her and said into her hair, "You did everything right. Do you hear me? Everything. You held on. That's all anybody can do, is hold on till help comes. And help has come now. I'm here. I'm not leaving. We'll think of something together, and you don't have to be the man anymore. You can just be a girl, all right? You can just be 13. And in the next room, the other three stood in the doorway listening, and the smallest one came and climbed into Clara's lap alongside her sister without a word, and the other two crept close, and the war widow, who had been told her whole life that she was worthless because she could give no man sons, sat in a cold ranch kitchen in Wyoming with 4 children who were not hers wrapped around her like the roots of a tree around a stone. And she understood for the first time in her life exactly what she had been made for. She stayed. What follows is the story of one winter and of how a woman the world had thrown away saved 4 children and a piece of land and was saved by them in turn. The first thing Clara did when the crying was done and the faces were washed was take stock like a general. She walked every foot of that ranch with Mary and Ruth at her side. She counted the cattle, 26 head, gaunter than they should be going into winter, but alive.
She checked the hay and found there was not enough, not nearly enough to carry 26 head through a Wyoming winter, and she understood that the children had not known how to put up enough, and there had been no one to teach them and no money to buy more. She looked at the sky, at the high, thin clouds racing, at the way the horses stood with their tails to the north, and she had grown up on a farm, and she could read weather the way other people read print, and she did not like what she read. Winter was coming early, and it was coming hard. So they worked. Lord, how they worked. Clara taught those girls everything her own hard life had taught her, and they were quick to learn because they had to be. She taught them to cut and stack the late hay properly so it would not rot and would stretch further.
She taught them which of the cattle to sell now, before the snow, the old and the weak that would not survive the winter anyway, and how to drive them, she and Mary together on the 2 saddle horses, the long 40 miles not to Coldwater where Crane's eyes were, but 2 days further to a different town, Sweetwater Bend, where nobody knew the Hollis name, and a stock buyer paid them honest money, real money, $80 for 9 head. It was the first cash that ranch had seen in months. Clara sewed it into the lining of her own dress for the ride home, and did not breathe easy until it was hidden under a floorboard beneath the stove. She taught them to set snares for rabbits and to shoot. She had learned to shoot from Tom in the lean years, and she taught Ruth, who had the steady hands and the still nerve for it, to put a bullet where she aimed it with the old Winchester that had been their father's. She taught them that you do not waste, ever, that the fat is rendered and the bones are boiled and the hide is kept, and there is no such thing as garbage on a ranch that means to survive. She salvaged the frost-killed garden and put up what could be put up. She mended their clothes by firelight until her eyes ached, turning their father's shirts into clothes for the girls, because there was no money for cloth, and Ezra Hollis had no more need of shirts. And she fed them. Every night, no matter how hard the day, she put a hot supper on that table, and she made the watching children believe, meal by meal, that there would be another one tomorrow, that the kindness was the kind you could keep. It was slow. Naomi still sometimes asked in a small voice whether it was for keeps, but less and less. The thaw between the older girls and the stranger came slower than it did with the little ones, because the older girls had farther to come back from.
Esther, 7, was the first of the big ones to soften. She was a tender-hearted child who loved her hen and her sisters and would have loved a stone if it sat still long enough. And within a week, she had begun following Clara about the place, narrating everything she saw. Ruth, 10, was harder. Ruth had decided somewhere in the long months of fear that the way to survive was to need nothing and trust no one. And she watched Clara with a flat, suspicious wariness, waiting, Clara understood, for the kindness to turn out to be a trick, the way she had perhaps already learned the world's kindnesses often did. Clara did not push her. She only kept on, day after day, being exactly as good as her word, until one afternoon Ruth, watching Clara struggle to free a calf that had got itself tangled in brush, came without being asked and helped, and afterward, wiping her hands, said gruffly, "You're not as soft as you look." From Ruth, Clara would learn this was very nearly a declaration of love. And Mary, who had carried it all. The strange thing was that Mary's surrender was the hardest of all, because Mary had to learn to lay down a weight she had been carrying so long that her whole self had grown around it. For the first weeks, she could not stop. She would wake before Clara and have the fire going. She would try to do the man's work and the girl's work both. She could not let herself rest, because rest had become the same thing as failure in her mind. And one night, Clara found her out behind the barn in the dark, standing at the low mound of earth where her father lay, with a wooden marker she had made herself from a board. And Mary was talking to it, very low, telling her dead father about the cattle and the hay and the money under the floor, reporting to him like a soldier to an officer. And Clara's heart broke clean in two. She did not interrupt. She waited until the girl was done.
Then she came and stood beside her in the cold starlight, and after a while she said, "He'd be proud of you. You know that." "I keep thinking I should have done more," Mary said. "I keep thinking if I'd known more, been older, he might not have—" "No," Clara said it firmly. "He died of a sickness in his chest, 40 miles from any doctor, the same as my husband did with a doctor right in town. You did not fail him, Mary. There are things no amount of being older could have changed, and a body taken by sickness is one of them. You hear me? You did not fail him. You saved his children, all 4 of them. You kept them fed and warm and together through the worst thing that can happen to a family. That is not failing. That is the bravest thing I have ever heard of in my life." Mary was quiet a long time. Then, in the dark, in a very small voice, she asked the question that all of them, Clara would come to understand, were holding their breath to ask. "Are you going to stay? Really stay?
Or are you going to leave when it gets too hard?" And Clara Finch looked up at the enormous, cold sky, at more stars than she had ever seen back east, and she thought about everything that lay ahead. The winter, the bank, the man named Crane with the appetite for that creek, the long odds, the near impossibility of it. And she said, without hesitation, the truest thing she had ever said. "I'm staying," she said. "These are my children now, if they'll have me. I came here to be a wife, and there's no husband to be had. But I'll tell you what I found instead. I found out what I'm for. I spent 31 years being told I was good for nothing because I never bore a child, and I came 2,000 miles to find 4 children who needed exactly what I had to give. I don't believe that's an accident, Mary. I believe I was sent. And I am not going anywhere. Not for the bank, not for the winter, not for the devil himself. Now come inside. It's cold, and your sisters need you, and so, I find, do I." And Mary Hollis took the hand of the woman who was becoming her mother, and they walked back to the house together, and the light from the window fell yellow and warm across the snow that had begun, that very night, quietly to fall. The snow did not stop for 3 days. There is an old man in that country, still living when this tale was last told, who remembers the winter of 1888, and he will tell you it was the worst in 40 years. 3 days of wind that came down off the mountains screaming. 3 days of snow that did not fall so much as fly sideways, that piled against the north wall of the house until it covered the window. 3 days in which the world beyond the door simply ceased to exist, erased, white, howling. And it was during those 3 days, when no one could have come and no one could have gone, that Clara Finch earned forever the love of those 4 girls, because it was during those 3 days that little Esther took sick. It came on fast, the way it does with children. A cough first, then a fever, then by the second night a rattle in the small chest that Clara knew, that Clara had heard before in her own husband at the end, the sound that had no business in a 7-year-old. The child burned. She did not know her sisters. She cried out for her mother, her real mother, dead these 4 years, and the sound of it in that snowbound house was a sound to break the strongest heart. And here is where the world's cruelty showed itself for the lie it was. Because the woman the people of Missouri had called worthless, the barren widow good for nothing, turned out to be worth, in that howling dark, more than every comfortable soul who had ever looked down on her put together.
Clara Finch had set up with the dying her whole life. She knew things. She knew to keep the child's chest warm and her head cool. She knew to fill the room with steam from a kettle on the stove to ease the laboring lungs. She knew the mustard plaster and how to make it and how to watch it so it drew without burning. She knew that fever must be fought, but not too fast, that you do not plunge a burning child into cold, but bring her down slow. And she knew the one thing that mattered more than all her knowledge put together, which was that you do not leave them, not for one moment, not to sleep, not to rest, that a sick and frightened child must never once open her eyes and find herself alone. For 2 days and 2 nights, Clara Finch did not sleep. She held that child through the worst of it. She bathed her and dosed her and breathed steam with her and prayed over her and sang to her old hymns in a low voice. And when little Esther in her fever wept for her dead mother, Clara held her closer and said, "I'm here, baby. I'm right here. I've got you. I'm not going to let go." And she did not let go. The other 3 girls did what Clara told them, fetching water, tending the kettle, keeping the fire fed against the killing cold outside. And they watched this stranger fight for their sister's life with everything she had, and nothing held back. And somewhere in those 2 terrible days, the last wall in all of them came down. Because there is a thing children know in their bones, a thing they cannot be fooled about, and it is this: they know who will stay. They had been failed before. The world had taken their mother and then their father and had stood by, comfortable and far away, while 4 little girls fought to survive alone. And now here was a woman who had no blood claim on them, no reason on earth to be there, who could have walked away the first hour and been blameless. And instead, she was on her knees in the lamplight in the 3rd night of a blizzard, refusing to let death take one more thing from them. On the 3rd morning, the wind died, and as the first pale, clean light came through the window where the snow had melted back from the warmth within, little Esther's fever broke. She opened her eyes, and they were clear, and she looked up at the exhausted woman bending over her, and she said in a small, croaking voice, "I'm hungry." And Clara Finch, who had not wept through any of it, who had been a wall and a fortress and a fixed point for 4 frightened girls for 2 days and nights, put her face down against that child's damp hair and finally, quietly, cried. After that, there was no more question of stranger or family. After that, the 4 girls called her Clara to her face and Mama to each other. And one day, in the deep of that winter, little Naomi, climbing into her lap, called her Mama right out loud without thinking, and then froze, terrified she had done something wrong. And Clara only held her tighter and said, "Yes, baby, yes, that's right." And that was that. The winter ground on. They survived it the way the strong and the stubborn and the loving survive such things, one day at a time. The cattle huddled in the lee of the barn and fed from the dwindling hay. The family huddled in the warm house and fed from Clara's endless ingenuity. Rabbits from Ruth's snares, the last of the bacon, beans, cornmeal, the eggs from the hens they had managed to keep alive. They were never full that winter, but they were never starving either. And there is a world of difference between those 2 things, the whole difference between despair and hope. And in the long, dark evenings, with the wind moaning in the stovepipe and the girls mending or whittling or learning their letters from the family Bible because Clara was determined they would not grow up ignorant, Clara would sometimes tell them stories. and sometimes Mary, growing easier, growing younger by the week as the weight came off her, would tell about their father, the good times, before the war years and the hard years, and a kind of healing happened in that telling. The grief did not go away. Grief does not go away. But it changed, the way ice changes to water, from a thing that cuts to a thing that flows, and the four girls began, slowly, to be children again. But the spring was coming, and with the spring would come Silas Crane. He came on a green morning in late April, when the snow was gone from all but the north slopes, and the creek was running high and brown and loud, and the first grass was coming up impossibly tender and bright across the hills.
He came in a fine buggy with a hired man riding alongside, and he came up the wagon road as though he already owned it, which, in his own mind, he very nearly did. Clara saw him coming a mile off, and she had time to prepare. She had been preparing, in truth, all winter. She sent the little ones into the house and told them to stay there no matter what they heard. She kept Mary beside her because Mary was the one who knew the ranch and the papers and would have to learn to face such men in the years to come. And she had Ruth, 10 years old and the best shot among them, sitting quietly on an upturned bucket on the porch with her father's Winchester across her knees, not pointed at anyone, not threatening, just there, just visible, the way a thing can be a fact without being a threat. Silas Crane drew up his buggy in the yard.
He was a soft, heavy, well-fed man in a good coat with small, pale eyes and a smile that never reached them, the kind of man who has learned that cruelty goes down easier when it is wrapped in courtesy. He looked at Clara, and he looked at the children's clothes cut down from a man's shirts, and he looked at the gaunt cattle in the corral, and he looked at the ranch with the eyes of a man pricing a thing he intends to take, and his smile widened. "Well now," he said, "I'd heard old Ezra had got himself some kind of housekeeper. Didn't expect a lady. Silas Crane, ma'am. I hold the paper on this place, and I've come to speak with Ezra Hollis about a payment that's come due." "Mr. Hollis isn't able to see you," Clara said, calm as still water. "Isn't able." Crane's smile sharpened. "He's not been able to come to town in some while, I hear. Folks say he's gone queer, gone strange. Some say worse." He let that hang. "But the note doesn't care about a man's troubles, ma'am. The note says $240 due the 1st of May, or the land reverts to the bank. That's 3 days off, so I'll need to speak with him, troubled or no, because I'll not take a payment or a refusal from a hired woman." He climbed down from the buggy. "Where is he? In the house? I'll speak to him myself." And he started toward the house, toward the door behind which 3 frightened children waited, and Clara Finch stepped into his path. She was not a large woman. She came barely to his shoulder, but she stood in front of that door like the door itself, and something in her face stopped Silas Crane in his tracks, some quality he had not expected and did not know what to do with, the absolute immovable steadiness of a person who has already faced down death and found it less frightening than the man before her. "You'll not go in that house," she said quietly. "There are children in there, and you've frightened them enough already, riding up like Judgment Day. You want to talk business, you'll talk it with me, in the yard, like a Christian. I told you I'll not deal with a hired—" "I'm not the hired woman." Clara's voice did not rise, but it changed, and the change in it was like the change in the air before lightning. "I'm Clara Finch. I came to this place to marry Ezra Hollis. I have his letter and the advertisement," he answered, "in my own hand and his. And you're right, Mr. Crane, he's not able to see you. He's not been able to see anyone since the first frost. Ezra Hollis is dead. He took sick in his chest in the autumn, and he died, and he's buried behind that barn, and these 4 children have been keeping it secret all winter because they were terrified of exactly this, of you riding up to take the only home they've ever known the moment you learned there was no man left to stop you." The silence that followed was enormous. Even the creek seemed to hush. Silas Crane's pale eyes went from Clara to Mary, white-faced beside her, to the rifle across Ruth's knees, and Clara watched the arithmetic happen behind those eyes, watched him understand that the land was, as far as he was concerned, already his. 4 orphan girls and a stray widow could no more pay $240 in 3 days than they could fly, and the law would hand him the deed clean and legal, and watched the satisfaction begin to creep across his soft face. "Well, Crane said, and he could not quite keep the pleasure out of it. Well, that is a sad thing indeed. Orphan children. He shook his head with a counterfeit sorrow that was, of all the things he did that day, perhaps the worst. But ma'am, you've as much as confirmed my position. The note is owed. There's no man to work this land, no money to pay the debt, and now no husband for you to boot. I'm afraid the kindest thing, the Christian thing, since you mention it, would be for the bank to take the property and place these poor children somewhere they can be properly looked after. An orphanage, perhaps, in Cheyenne. They'd be fed, clothed. It's no life for little girls, scrabbling on a failed ranch with a barren widow. He let the word fall deliberately, having clearly heard the gossip that traveled even out here, the word the world used to make Clara small. No, the bank will take the land. Day after tomorrow I'll return with the sheriff and the papers, and we'll do this all legal and proper. You'd best use the time to pack the children's things. He turned to go, well pleased, a man who had won. The payment is $240, Clara said. That's right. He paused, half amused. 240. You don't have it. I do have it. The yard went still again. Crane turned slowly back around. I beg your pardon? And Clara Finch reached into the pocket of her apron, and she drew out a small, heavy cloth bundle. And she did something then that she would remember for the rest of her life, that all four girls would remember and tell their own children. She crossed the yard to the hated man, and she counted it out into his soft pink hand, dollar by dollar, the money sewn into her dress on the long ride from Sweetwater Bend, the money from the 9 head of cattle, the eggs sold to a peddler, the $80 and the careful hoarding and the going without of a whole hard winter. And the last of it, the part that made up the difference, was Clara Finch's own, the few dollars she had carried west to start a new life with, and the small gold ring that had been her grandmother's, the only thing of value she owned in all the world, which a traveling tinker had given her $11 for when she had quietly sent it to Sweetwater Bend with the stock buyer in February, telling no one, because she had done the arithmetic in the dark one night and found they would come up just short, $240, to the penny. There, she said, count it. It's all there. The note is paid. The land is theirs. Silas Crane stared at the money in his hand as though it had turned to coals. His soft face worked. This doesn't change the situation, he sputtered. There's still no man here. 4 girls and a widow can't work a cattle ranch. You'll be back in debt by next spring, and Maybe we will, Clara said, and maybe we won't. But that's not your business, Mr. Crane, because the note is paid, and the land is free and clear, and what we do with our own land from this day forward is between us and the Almighty, and no concern whatever of yours. You came here today to take a home from 4 orphan children because you wanted the water that runs through it. You wrapped it up in Christian charity and orphanages and concern. But I have nursed dying men, and I have buried a husband, and I have sat through one whole night while a child I love nearly died in my arms, and I know the difference between a man who cares and a man who covets, and you, sir, are no Christian. Now you've been paid every cent you're owed. Take it and get off this land, and don't you ever come up this road again. For a long moment, Silas Crane stood there holding the money, and the full weight of it settled on him, that he had ridden up to gloat and to take, and instead stood beaten in a muddy yard by a woman he had called barren, in front of his own hired man, with a 10-year-old girl on the porch and a rifle on her knees, and the whole high green country looking on. His pale eyes burned with a hatred that had no outlet, because the thing was done. The money was real. The note was paid, and there was not one legal thing in all the world he could do about it. He turned without another word and climbed into his buggy and drove away down the wagon road, faster than he had come, and his hired man, who had watched the whole thing, touched his hat to Clara as he turned to follow. Just barely, just enough. And there was something in it that said he had seen what he had seen and would tell it in town, and that the telling would not go the way Silas Crane would wish. And it didn't. That is one of the things worth saying about this story. The hired man told it in the saloon in Coldwater that very night. told how the rich banker had ridden out to throw 4 orphans off their land, and how a widow woman had counted out the debt to the penny and faced him down and sent him home with his tail between his legs. And the story ran through that town like fire through dry grass. And the people of Coldwater, who had clucked all winter about the haunted Hollis place and never once ridden out, felt the shame of it land on them, as well they should have. And shame in decent people turns to action. By summer, there was a different traffic on the Hollis Road. A neighbor with a wagon load of seed potatoes who said he'd had extra, a widower with grown sons who came to help with the branding and would take no pay, the women of the church who came with quilts and canned goods, and, more than that, with apology written all over their faces, and stayed to sit at Clara's table and become, at last, her friends. Silas Crane found, that summer and after, that the country had turned cold to him in a way that money could not warm, and within 3 years he had sold his bank and moved to Denver, and the country was glad to see the back of him. But that came later. On the day Crane drove away, Clara Finch stood in the yard until the buggy was out of sight, and then her knees went a little weak, because being a wall is harder than it looks, and Mary caught her arm, and Ruth came off the porch with the rifle, and the door of the house burst open, and the 2 little ones came flying out, having heard everything through the thin walls, and the 5 of them stood there in the muddy spring yard and held on to each other and laughed and cried at the same time, the way you do when a long terror finally lifts. "It's ours," Mary kept saying, as though she could not believe it. "It's really ours. He's gone. It's really, truly ours." "It's yours," Clara said, holding her. "Free and clear, your pa's land, and yours after him, and no man can take it from you now." "Ours," Mary corrected her, fierce, pulling back to look her in the eye. "Yours too. You paid for it. You gave your grandmother's ring. Don't think I don't know what that ring meant to you. It's ours." "All 5 of us. Say it's ours." And Clara Finch, who had come west to be a wife and had buried that hope in a cold grave the very first hour, who had been called barren and worthless and good for nothing by a world too blind to see what she was, looked at the 4 girls who had made her, against every expectation, a mother, and at the land, green now and running with sweet water, that was, against every expectation, a home. And she said the word. "Ours," she said. "All right. Ours." They stayed, all of them, and they made it work. It was not easy. Nothing about that life was ever easy. But Clara Finch had spent her whole life making something out of nothing, and 4 daughters who would walk through fire for her made the something a great deal larger. They built the herd back up, slow and careful. The widower with the grown sons turned out to be a kind and steady man named John Pruitt, who took to riding over more than the branding strictly required, and who looked at Clara Finch not as a barren widow, but as the strongest and finest woman he had ever met. And after 2 years of patient, chaste, old-fashioned courting, with 4 daughters watching like hawks and approving entirely, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes, and they were wed in the little church in Coldwater that had once gossiped about her, with the whole town in attendance and not a dry eye in the building. And so Clara got, in the end, the husband she had crossed a country for, only better, and 4 daughters into the bargain, and the family that the world had told her she would never have. They grew up well, those girls. Mary, who had been the man of the ranch at 13, grew into a woman of such quiet strength that she ran the largest and best-kept ranch in that whole part of the country, and never married, and never needed to, and was beloved by every child in the county who knew that Miss Hollis always had a warm kitchen and a kind word. Ruth, the steady shot with the wary heart, married a deputy and then outlived him and ran their place herself, and was known as a woman you did not cross and did not need to fear if you were honest. Esther, who had nearly died in the blizzard, grew up tender as ever and married a preacher and filled a parsonage with children of her own, and named her first daughter Clara. And little Naomi, who had asked whether kindness was for keeps, grew up never having to ask that question again, and became a schoolteacher, and taught 2 generations of frontier children their letters, and told every one of them when they were frightened or alone that help comes, that you have only to hold on till it does, because she had learned it herself in a snowbound house in the arms of a woman who would not let go.
And Clara Finch Pruitt lived to be an old, old woman and saw grandchildren and great-grandchildren and sat on the porch of that long, low ranch house in the evenings, looking out over the creek and the green hills. And when strangers passing through would ask about her, the people of that country would tell the story. They would tell how a war widow answered an advertisement for a husband and arrived to find no husband at all, only 4 orphan girls keeping a terrible secret and a dying ranch alone.
They would tell how she could have turned around and gone home and no one would have blamed her, and how she stayed instead and made 1 pot of stew and then never left. They would tell how the woman the world called barren turned out to be the truest mother 4 children ever had. They would tell how she sold her own grandmother's ring to save a stranger's land and faced down a rich man with nothing but the truth, and won. And here is the thing they understood in that country, the thing worth carrying away from this old tale. They understood that there had never been anything wrong with Clara Finch. The whole long sorrow of her early life, all those years of being made to feel worthless because her body would not do the one thing the world had decided was a woman's only worth, all of it had been a lie, the world's lie, the world's blindness, never hers. She had not been barren, she had been waiting. There had been 4 children on the far side of a continent who needed exactly the heart she had, and a heart like that is not wasted, not ever, no matter how long it goes unspent. The world had looked at Clara Finch and seen an empty woman. God, it seems, had looked at the same woman and seen a mother who simply had not yet been brought to her children. And the old folks in that country, the ones who remembered, would finish the story the same way every time. They would say that the strongest thing in this hard world is not a gun or a bank or a winter storm or a covetous man with the law on his side. The strongest thing is a person who decides to stay, who looks at 4 frightened children in a dark yard with every reason in the world to walk away, and instead rolls up her sleeves and asks when they last had a hot supper. That, they would say, is what saves us, not the strong, not the rich, not the proud. But the ones who stay, and the ones who hold on, and the ones who refuse, against all the cold and all the dark and all the long odds of this world, to let go. And then they would look out at the creek running bright through the Hollis land, where it runs to this very day, and they would fall quiet, and after a while, if you were the sort of person who needed to ask, they might ask you in return, when your own dark night comes, and the snow is flying, and you are frightened and alone and certain that no help is coming, will you have the faith to hold on just 1 more hour? And when you come upon someone else in the dark, cold and hungry and afraid, with no claim on you at all, will you be the kind who rides on past, comfortable and blameless, or will you be the kind who stays?